Welcome everyone. Today we are painting some beautiful loose flowers on the Strathmore watercolor cards. They come with their own envelopes, which I am so excited about. And the paper itself is a nice 140-pound cold pressed watercolor paper that is 5 inches by 6 7/8 inches. They also are pre-folded, which is very convenient. For the tape that we're using today, I am using just a regular masking tape that I have around the house, nothing special, but you can buy a low tack art tape that is easier to pull off the paper and will not rip it up. This tape, I'm just going to be extra careful when I take it off at the end. The brush that I'm using today, I believe, is a number 10 round. I've had it for so long the number has worn off, but it seems to be about that size. And then for the watercolors that I'm using today, they are the Rosa Gallery watercolors, which I just swatched for an upcoming video. I'm so excited about them. They're the botanical 28 colors. And that's what we'll be using today. But you can use any watercolors that you have around the house. So for the first color, I am mixing the emerald green with the cadmium yellow light to make this bright botanical green for the stem of the flower. For the petals of the flowers, I am using, it's called Magenta Rose. Any pink or violet that you have, or red, whatever color is fine, but I'm using the Magenta Rose. And I'm putting a little bit of the paint right onto the palette, the little well that holds the water, and adding a little bit of water to it as well to thin down the paint so it's a bit of a lighter Magenta Rose color. Next, we're thinking of an oval or a circle towards the top of your paper and putting about 8 to 10 just little tiny dots. Then rinsing out your brush in the water and bringing it to meet the dots, which then the paint flows out into the water and makes a really fun effect on your paper. So in between brushes, or in between petals, you're going to rinse out your brush, so it's just water on your brush, and form the shape of the petal, and then you'll touch that tiny dot of paint with the brush and bring that color into the petal as much of it as you would like. You could just kind of touch it with the paintbrush and see what happens and leave it alone, or you can manipulate it a bit by moving it around. But I really like the look of it, just leaving it as is. Of course, I can't help but go back into it a little bit, but just as is. I think it's so much fun just to see how the paint and the water interact with the paper and the swirls and the texture that they make. For this flower, I have 6 petals. And I will go back into them to add a little bit more color, but for now I'm just going to move them around a little bit so that they're in the shape that I want, and then wait for them to dry. If you see you have too much of a puddle, you can wipe off the water from your brush just like I'm doing here and soak back up a little bit of that puddle so that it leaves a lighter color behind. And less water, less paint, just kind of soaks it back up like a sponge. While the paper is still wet, you can charge the petals with more pigment, more paint, so that it flows into the still wet paper. I dry my brush off and soak up just a little more. There's a little puddle of paint right at the tip of this petal, so I'm just soaking that up a bit. I just want it to be a little bit lighter than it is. Then I rinse off my brush completely, and I'm using the cadmium yellow light for the little bit of yellow right in the interior of the flower. Just little dots of the color. Then right in the very center of the flower, I went in with the cadmium lemon yellow, which is brighter than the cadmium yellow light. For the green of the stem, I have mixed the bright green with the cadmium yellow light. I start at the tip of the petal. I'm trying to decide where to put it, but I decided to start at the kind of the center of the flower, the tip of the petal, and I'm making a curvy line down. I was looking at pictures of poppies and anemones and kind of meshed the two ideas together. So I have the more rounded seed of the poppy or bud of the poppy, but more of the flower shape of the anemone, and then the more curvy stem of the poppy. For the seed, I just use the same green and make a sphere or a circle and leave just a little bit of white space as if the sunlight is hitting that bud. For the second bud, I start off with drawing a sphere, and again with that same mixture of the green and the yellow together. You don't have to use the same colors to get that same effect, but green and a yellow will make a nice bright green, and that's the initial wash or the initial layer. So we're going to put more color into that once it's dry, and a little bit more color into it while it's still wet. So for the stem, or for the top bud, we're putting a little bit of these called ultramarine blue, but you can use any blue. While your green is still wet, the blue will turn it into a dark green. The ultramarine blue from this Rosa Gallery botanical set is gorgeous. I think it's one of the prettiest ultramarine colors I've ever seen. For the stem, for the bud at the top right hand corner, I'm starting right at the edge of the flower petal and arching it to meet the side of the bud, and then bringing that stem down all the way to the edge of the paper. You can see as I paint that the paint is getting thinner, so there is now more water than paint on my brush. I'm going back in and adding some more of the pigments, more of the paint to my brush, so then I can darken up my stem a little bit. Now that I have about the shade that I want of the green, I'm going back in again with the ultramarine blue and allowing it to create a darker color area, a shadow on the stem. So because the stem is still wet, it just flows nicely into that green color, and I just really love that effect. For the second bud, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm starting with that very light green and swooping down from the top of the bud all the way to the paper. For the middle flower stem, I was just wetting it so that the color that I'll be putting into it will flow nicely and not make hard lines. You could do that by just putting clear water on your brush and wetting it down, or it's just more of that light green if you want to add a little bit more of the color into it. So for the center flower as well, I'm adding some of that ultramarine blue, and it can be any shade of blue that you like. when you add it to the green, it will create a beautiful dark green color. And then I am bringing it down the stems to add a little bit of interest, to make it look a little bit three-dimensional, just down one side of the stems. And I'm doing this for all 3 stems. That way it kind of looks like the sun is shining from the right-hand side of the paper or the scene, and the shadow is on the left-hand side of the objects or the stems. I'm also adding just a little bit more of a shadow to the larger bud by using the color that's already on the brush from adding the blue to the stems. It's just a bit of a darker green. Then I'm rinsing off my brush completely because I'm going to add that little green mound right in the center of the flower that you a lot of times see in poppies and also in anemones. And I'm using that same bright green that I initially used on the stems. For a minute, I thought I might want to add a little more color into the center of the flower, so I added a few drops of the orange, and then right away decided it was too dark, changed my mind. So a great thing, or an easy way to fix that problem, is to use a paper towel and carefully not to soak up anything around it, but you can dab it onto the color and soak it right back up. And then I went back in with a bit more watered down version of that color and added just a little extra hint of color to the inside of it. While the first flower is drying, we're going to move to the other side of the card and use the violet color, which is really dark, a really dark deep color, and just a little bit of the, I think it's called quinacridone violet as well. Both of these violets are very dark and deep violets. They're very beautiful. Just a tiny little bit goes a very long way. It's also a difficult color to soak back up or lift back up from your paper. So I would start with a very watered down color first. So initially I have the 1 dot at the top, 3 dots, and then a little cluster of dots. I'm using the same brush and trying to keep negative or white space, the white paper in between the dots a little bit, so it doesn't just look like clouds of purple, so that you could maybe imagine there are petals being hit by the sunlight. The inspiration for this was a combination of catmint and lilac, just those beautiful spring and summer flowers that you might have in your garden, those beautiful purples and violets. As I'm creating the petals, it does remind me of painting clouds, as you do not want to go dark at first. You definitely want to try to keep a lighter wash, and then you can go back in and add more color as you go. While I was creating these petals, I wish I had been a little bit more loose with them. So feel free to get very loose and create larger petals. Mine look a little bit too stylized, a little bit too tight, but I was having a lot of fun doing the swirls and the dots and trying to keep them loose. That's one of the big things I'm trying these days, is to loosen up my style and not be too tight with it. So the next thing I'm doing now is I'm going in with that magenta rose and putting dots of the magenta rose throughout all of the wet petals, and then going in for some of that violet the dark violet, the darkest violet, and putting dots of that darkest violet throughout. And because the paint is still wet on the very bottom one, the paint is the wettest, you can see how the color is spreading out when you put a little dot of that color or you charge that area with a dot of color. It spreads out and creates these beautiful new colors and a lot of interest. But the top few layers of petals, they dried really quickly on this paper. This paper doesn't hold quite as much water as the Arches paper does. So I'm going back in with my damp brush and re-wetting all those petals so that I can add back in the color, just like with the bottom layer, and have it spread out instead of it staying just little dots of color and not creating the effect that I was hoping for. So now I'm putting that color back in, and you can see that it is spreading out because that paint is wet again. The paper is wet again, and so the new paint is able to spread out and create that beautiful effect that I was looking for. Now that the first flower is dry, I want to go back and give it a second layer to some of the petals, where some people call it glazing. It's just a second wash of color or a second layer of color, or a glaze to on top of the first layer of color. So what I'm doing is using the magenta rose that has some water added to it. I've already had it mixed up on the palette, and very gently with the brush, I'm glazing the petal to add some more of that magenta pink color on top of it. And I'm trying to keep a bit of the texture underneath, a bit of the light and dark that's already there, to give the petal a fresh light feeling. I don't want to go over it with a thick layer of paint. I wanted a very, very thin glazing layer so that the layer underneath still shows through a bit, and I'm just adding some more color to the petal. Because the flower is so loose and free-flowing, it might be a bit difficult to decide where to put the glaze of extra color, but it's whatever looks best to you, whatever feels good. I think this is a lot of fun with loose flowers. You can make it up as you go and just place the color where you think it will look nice. So now I'm adding in a bit more color to that first petal that I went over to make it look like there's a bit of a shadow, to make the flower look a bit more three-dimensional. And then I noticed a little bit of a pooling in the shadow, so I dry off my brush and I picked it up with the brush. Going back to the second flower, we are ready to add the stem. The petals are all dry, and I am mixing a little bit of the violet with a little bit of the magenta rose, just to lighten it up a bit, to make sure I put it where I want it in case I need to soak it back up if I make a mistake. So I'm trying to decide which way I want the stem to bend. You can do it whichever way you think it would look best on your paper. At the very top, I'm just adding little marks so that it looks like it's all connected together. I do that between the bottom group of flowers and the next tier of flowers. But then I decided I thought it looked a little bit too thick, so I blotted it back up with a paper towel. And you can see it doesn't come up all the way. That violet really does, I don't know if stain is the right word, but it is very hard to pick back up from the paper. For the stem and the leaves of the second flower, I wanted a cooler, deeper green, so a more of a blue-green. And to do that, I'm mixing the ultramarine blue with the bright green. So here I have the ultramarine blue already in the well. Rinse my brush, go into the bright green, and I'm mixing that bright green and the ultramarine blue together. For the first leaf, I'm swooping down to meet the stem on the top and then swooping down to meet the stem on the bottom. It kind of looks like a goldfish cracker shape, but without the tail. And then quickly filling it in with the green so as to not leave just the outlines, so that the whole leaf is filled in right away with the green paint. While the green paint is still wet, I am adding just a little bit of the ultramarine blue. This makes a beautiful dark blue-green and gives the leaves a little more color, a little more interest, and I really like the way the two colors are coming together. The last thing we're doing is adding a swoop of the green down the stem to match the leaves. And there we have it, a finished botanical card with loose florals. I'm very carefully removing the tape. I tried to pull it out at an angle away from the paper and go very slowly as to not tear the delicate paper. I hope to get it in the mail soon to a loved one. I think they will really enjoy it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope to see you next time. I hope you are able to create today, to paint, to go for a walk, to see loved ones, and have a wonderful rest of your day. See you next time.